There will be a lot of homilies this weekend in various churches about marriage, but I would like to speak about something else. If you recall, Paul also, in his letter to the Ephesians, cites this verse from Genesis. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. But then Paul writes, this is a great mystery. And I refer to Jesus Christ and his church. So I'd like to explore that a little bit of what Paul means by that, of what this verse can say to us about Jesus' relationship to us and his church and our relationship to him. First of all, we see Adam, he's naming the animals that God brings to him, because God says it's not good for the man to be alone. And so he starts bringing the other creatures. And Adam, as he names them in the mythopoetic language that is Genesis, the idea here is the reason Adam can name them is because he knows their nature. He knows what they are. It's Aquinas and would say it's one of Adam's preternatural gifts. It's one of the gifts he had before he sinned against God. So he knows the nature and can name them, but none are suitable companions for him. But Adam can do nothing about that, right? So God puts him into a deep sleep. And again, one of the things this means in this language is that Adam is not creating the woman. The man does not create the woman. The woman is still part of God's creation. But God takes the rib, so the woman is created from the depths of the man. So much so that when he sees her, he recognizes something about her, which is kind of interesting. We don't usually use the word recognize for the first time someone sees something, right? But Adam sees that there's an affinity between the woman and him. And he says, at last, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone, right? And then the commentary, when we get this line. That's why, right, the mother and father are not the suitable partner, if we can continue and kind of mix up the language a little bit, right? A man leaves his father and mother, he clings to his wife. There's a special relationship that's built up there. So much so that it cannot be broken. See, the language about divorce, you divorce two things that are put together, you can divorce them, right? There's still two things. I mean, you could, I guess, scrape the jelly off the peanut butter, right? But God does something when a man and a woman come together in marriage that makes them no longer the two people in some kind of like partnership or something, joined together that still can be separated. And that's where we get this language in the wedding rite, right? It comes from here. What God has joined, let no one put asunder, because human beings cannot undo what God does. See, people misunderstand divorce. You can't divorce one thing, right? If you have a board and you make it into two, we don't call that divorce, we call that breaking, right? And human beings cannot break what God has made, because God makes a bond, right? That's what we talk about, the marriage bond. It cannot be broken. And that's why, and people misunderstand this a lot about Catholic understanding, we don't talk about divorce, right? An annulment is not Catholic divorce, which is what you'll hear. An annulment is asking the question, when the couple said I do together, did God create that bond? And if God created the bond, then the church says we can't break it. And if the church realizes that God did not create a bond, then she says, well, you're free to marry because the bond was never there. It's still a marriage civilly, but it's not the bond. So there is no divorce in the Catholic understanding, right? The Catholic mind. What does all this have to do with Jesus? So we see man leaves his father and mother. We see Jesus leaving his father, so to speak. The language here is going to limp a little bit because it doesn't cover the whole mystery. Obviously, Jesus and the Father, they were still present together in some way, right? But Jesus leaves his Father, as we hear in that lovely hymn in Philippians, did not deem equality with God something to be grasped, rather emptied himself. So he lets go the form of being God, and he comes down to earth, and he takes the form of a slave. And he's known to be of human estate, right? But what's lovely about that is where it is Jesus' choice to come down, to join us. He's not ashamed, as we heard in the Hebrews section from Hebrews, he's not ashamed to call himself our brother. He's not ashamed to be human, right? So he takes on our human nature. He's not created human, right? He takes on our nature. So there's a parallel with Adam, and there are differences all along the way. And where Adam is put into a deep sleep, and the woman comes out of his side, Jesus dies on the cross. And in his death, in the thrust of the lance, the water and blood flow out from his side. And we've seen that from the earliest spiritual writers. We've seen that as to be the birth of the church, It's the water of baptism, the blood that cleanses us, The sacraments start there. The church starts from his side. And again, Adam was asleep when this all happened, and God did it. Jesus chooses to be crucified for us, right, in obedience and faithfulness to his Father. And so he has a role. He is creating the church himself in this. Right? And so we come to that word divorce. What God has joined, no human being can break, right? And in this process of taking on a human nature, dying for us, creating the church, there's a bond created there. And no matter what evil may happen in the church or people in the church do, Jesus is, to use the language, married to the church. The scriptures all call, over and over again, you hear that the church is Christ's bride, And this is marriage the way God understands it, not the way human beings have, in a flawed way, lived it out, right? There is no breaking this bond. Jesus will never leave his church. It's his own body. If you cut someone's head off, we wouldn't call that a divorce, right? But the church is Christ's bride, the body of Christ. And so Christ is forever and irretrievably linked to the church, bound to the church eternally now, in an unbreakable way. And so one of the things we might think about in this time, when in our lifetime it's probably the roughest time of the church, maybe not in our whole history, But we can be assured that Christ is not leaving his church, will never leave his church. He may discipline her, he may purify her, but he will never leave her. And the same goes for us individually, right? Paul also talks about that. He says, together we make up the church and we're individually members of it. And so the relationship that Jesus has with his church, he has with us individually as well. And so he will never leave us individually either. No matter what we do, no matter how we sin, we cannot break the bond between Jesus and us. We can mar it, we can turn away from God, we can, through mortal sin, even kill the divine charity that lives in us, but that's not breaking the bond that Jesus has with us. All we have to do is turn around again towards Jesus, towards God, and he will renew that relationship, right? But the bond that's between us and Jesus, the bond that is between the church and Jesus, is a bond that's created by God, and so nothing a human being can do can break it. And so this idea of, it's interesting, both Jesus and Paul quote this line from Genesis, and it's an important line for us. And yes, it says something about marriage and the indissolubility of marriage and the nature of marriage, but it also says something very important about the nature of Jesus' relationship with his church and Jesus' relationship with each of us.